what we'll do here is, because everything's videoing, we'll just go, okay, right, we're starting now. So, yeah, that's working now, it's working good. Also, let's go, sorry. On your tables, I've given you some little packs of names. It looks like this, some of them are loose. Just as a table, these are Jesus' ancestors. One of the things I found when I was doing is how interesting it was, because of course Jesus' ancestors carry the prophecies for Jesus. And so I used to mark his ancestors in green. And it was kind of interesting doing it that way, because suddenly you'd realise stories would take on a new meaning when you realise actually this is somebody who's involved with Jesus. Without being kind of too graphic at this point, you know, the story of Onan who spills his seed on the ground and he dies, do you remember? Now, I'm not saying it explains, because it always felt a bit of a harsh story to me, you know. And in all seriousness, and apologies for the graphicness here, in all seriousness, theologically, it becomes part of the reason that God doesn't like contraception in Catholicism, and in Protestantism, God doesn't like self-abuse, you see. But actually, suddenly you realise, but actually the problem here is that someone who carrying the prophecies of Jesus is refusing to have a child. Now, I'm not saying it answers everything, but I'm saying it does change the story a little bit. Does that make sense? Because he was coloured in green. But one of the things that is interesting is I started to notice, way back, how often the names of Jesus' ancestors seem to say something prophetic about him. And so what we're going to do is I've given you the first names in his ancestry line that just run from Noah up down to Noah, basically. And all you need to do is put them in order. And I've already told you the last one. So you want to work together and put the names that I put on your table. See if you can get them in order.
No, not at all.
There's no going down. So who was next?
Possibly.
Quick, the camera's on, put the Google away.
Could that be actually a surprise? Or is it just merely that one doing this blind? Yeah. See what we can spell.
Okay, some of you, just to give you a clue, you'll notice that they're grouped by colour. So, just make it a bit easier now. Okay, let's start drawing some attention to the front. Let's get the names in order first. So what name comes first in Jesus' genealogy? Elohim is first, yeah. In Luke's genealogy, he goes right the way back, son of Adam, son of God. So actually we put that one first. And so what comes next? Just told you. Adam, okay. After Adam is Seth, as we've already mentioned. After Seth is... Very good, very impressive. Enosh comes next. Yeah. What comes after Enosh? Kenan, very good. Yep, so good, we've got that one. What comes after Kenan? So this table is very impressive. They're very confident. They've obviously looked it up, haven't you? You are correct. Mahalel is the next one. Okay, what comes after Mahalel? Jared or Yared. After Yared? Enoch, yeah. After Enoch? Methuselah, after Methuselah, Lamech, and after Lamech, Noah. Now, if you turn them over, the cards over, you'll notice that there's some definitions of their names. And most of these are taken, and particularly in this one, are all from old historic sources. There are sometimes better modern ones, but I want you to show, I've shown you the kind of the old sources on translating the names, to show that this is not something kind of modern fitted to the task. These have historically been understood as what the names mean. So let's start with, well, Elohim. Well, we know that one, that's God, isn't it? So what about Adam? What does Adam mean? Yeah, so often we relate it to the Hebrew word for earthy or red, the dam bit, Adam, you see. But actually, Adam wasn't Hebrew, was he? Okay, and the oldest Semitic language we know anything about, which actually Hebrew is a subset of the older language, that they actually had a very early king, also called Adam, but he was actually Adamu. And so in Akkadian, which was Sumerian, which actually Hebrew was a subset of Sumerian, the first man is called Adamu. And Adamu is the same name, but with an extra, is actually related to an Akkadian word. It's got a proper Akkadian word. It means to create, to make, or to build. Which is interesting, isn't it? Because God made man in his image. So he gives him a name, Adamu, which can mean a creator. Okay. It can also mean a maker. Or a producer, which is interesting because the first thing he does is give him a garden and says, be fruitful. Do you remember? Or it can be a builder. And that's interesting because the second Adam was called a tecton, which we often translate as carpenter, but technically a tecton works in the building trade. See, we kind of miss this. A tecton, which is why an architecton, we get the English word architect from. He's not making kind of little stools, he's making buildings. He's a builder. That makes sense? So the first Adam was a producer, and that's the name means that. The second Adam was a builder, and the word means that as well. So I know that's not Hebrew, but actually it's part of the root of the name. So, yeah. But let's just make it simple. Let's just call it man. Okay, could be a builder, but I don't mind. So God, a man. Okay, Seth means is appointed or appointed. So God, a man is appointed. Oh, that's interesting. Starting to see something emerge. Okay, and then after that, Enosh. What does Enosh mean? Okay, it's got various translations there, and I'm not going to use all of them, but it goes through what are the meanings of Enosh? A mortal. Okay, that's a really interesting one to put in, isn't it? So it can mean failing, hence miserable, but actually the reason it's failing is because they're dying. So sometimes you'd even see it translated as dying. Or actually, the broadest is kind of, we think it's used as a word for a mortal person, someone who. So God, a man is appointed mortal. Okay, well that's beginning to be interesting, isn't it, as we run through the ancestors. And Kenan. What does Kenan mean? It can mean the same as Cain, because actually in Hebrew, one of the ways you take a name, you can make it, you can extend it, a bit like just trying to think of a good example. So I'm just trying to give a name that you can put a Y on the end. Because so let me give you an example. Solomon in Hebrew is not Solomon, sorry. In David's genealogy, Salmon, not Solomon, Salmon. You remember Salmon, famous Salmon? Okay. Salmon is the grandfather, I think, of Boaz, who then. But actually, he's referred to, sometimes he's just called Salma, and sometimes he's called Salma On. You see? Because on is just a way of extending the name. It kind of means like that, something like that. So it's a kind of a way of, you take a name and you extend it. So some people say it's just Cain, but extended. And others say, no, actually it's related to the word kinan, which is about lamenting and dirge and being sorrowful. That makes sense? If you take the sorrowful, it doesn't really matter one way or the other. You could just translate it as like Cain, which can mean born, begotten. So God, man is appointed mortal, is appointed mortal born. That makes sense? Or it's God, a man is appointed mortal and sorrowful. And actually, that's a very good description of the context Jesus is born into. When Jesus is born, people in the village that he's been born into get murdered. They're children. It's a sorrowful place. He's a man of sorrows. He's acquainted with grief. He's born into a tough situation. But that's not the end of the story, is it? So Mahalel. What does Mahalel mean? Okay, it can mean praise God. But more precisely, we often translate it that way, because it's got the word hallelujah in it, or the Hallel bit. The Hallel, praise God. But actually the Mahal bit actually is normally, it's got, the roots are to do with shining, and so often you'll see it translated probably more accurately as the glory of God. It's the shiningness of God, basically. The shiningness or the glory of God. Okay, Yared means, who's getting there behead of me? Descends. The glory of God, the shiningness of God descends. Still sounding like the story of Jesus, isn't it? Who is God, who is born a man who's mortal and is sorrowful. But now the glory of God descends. Okay, and then what's Enoch? To dedicate. The glory of God is descending to dedicate, which happens at his baptism, doesn't it? Dedicate him. Enoch, as with most Hebrew names, you've got a root word that can be a noun or a verb, depending on how it's used. And so Enoch is to dedicate, and if it's used as a noun, it's used of a teacher, because a teacher is someone who dedicates you to your trade. So you could translate it either way. So the glory of God descends to dedicate, or descends as a teacher, because after Jesus has been a builder all his life, but after the Spirit falls on him, he goes around the synagogues teaching wherever he goes. Does that make sense? To dedicate, but if it's to dedicate what? Well, what's the next name? Methuselah. Okay, Methuselah, because Enoch calls his son Methuselah, he's understood to be the first prophet in the Old Testament. Because actually what his name means is Meth, which is death, is his death, and then Selah bit is to bring or send something. And so his death shall bring it, is the way we translate it, or his death shall send it, make it happen. His death shall make it happen. See, what a great name. What were the parents thinking, just to be honest? But because he's called that, and the year that Methuselah dies is the year that the flood comes. See? So they looked at that and say, so Enoch was prophesying the flood by calling his kid, his death shall bring it. See, so he's the first prophet in the Old Testament. Okay? So in Jewish mindset, he brought judgment. Okay? But as we go on, the next name is Lamech. So Lamech means what does Lamech mean? Anyone got? Okay, it can you often see it translated in older translations as things like savage or wild man. But the root, to understand how they get there, is the mech bit means is about being low, okay, and the Lamech is to deliberately go there. So the Lamed, if you add it as a prefix to a word, it means to go there. So it's someone who's going low. So there are two Lamechs in the Bible, because to go low could imply going kind of wild and savage, which is why they translate it that way, or it could imply being humble. And one of them is good and one of them's bad, so you can see how it can work both ways. But I quite like, if that idea of going low is they've fallen effectively. His death shall bring, the wild, the fallen, the humble, the depraved. You can understand it that way, whatever. And what does Noah mean? Rest. So look at how that's why I colour coded it in three sections. You've got a threefold statement in the names down to Noah. God is appointed mortal, sorrowful. The glory of God descends to him to dedicate. His death shall bring the savage or the fallen rest, or even the humble rest. It could be either. And so suddenly Enoch was prophesying not judgment, he was actually prophesying, when you put it in that context, he's actually good news. He's actually prophesying good news. It's interesting, isn't it? So the Jewish tradition is he prophesied judgment. But actually, as you see it there, we see good news. It's the rest that's coming. And those are all standard, old school translations of the names. You can continue this through the names of Jesus' ancestors, and we'll do it in later sessions, but we'll do it now. Some of them, as we go forward, I'm going to have to draw on more modern sources because you can't find it in the Victorian ones. But you can still find, in modern understandings of the translations of the biblical names, you still find emerging testimony to Jesus as we can keep going through. So, see that? We're going to skip through some of the other threads because we're going to run out of time. But one of the other things which we find regularly is models of Jesus through the Old Testament. We call them types. Theologians refer to them as types. And there's a lot of arguments, and if you go to Bible college, you might get taught that you're only allowed to see a model of Jesus in something if the Bible tells you it's there. Okay? Which I, just so you know, in a reasonable thing, in a way, think is total rubbish. Okay? Because the thing with a type is, it only means something if you see it. And if you see it, then you've seen it. Does that make sense? But what do I mean by that? Well, it's interesting how things and models kind of repeat themselves. And it's almost like Jesus becomes the whole idea of the type is, here's a mini model, and then Jesus does it in big scale, you see. And so I'm not going to do lots of them. There are thousands of them, loads and loads of them. So here's some kind of examples. For instance, there are saviours in the book of Judges. And we're going to look at the period of Judges in a couple of sessions' time. So we will actually look at how they model Jesus a bit more specifically when we get there. There are people who are called redeemers, like Boaz, in the book of Ruth. There are priests, like Melchizedek and like Joshua, who's the anointed priest in the days of Nehemiah and so on. And there are kings like David and Solomon who model Jesus in different ways. Of course, there are prophets like Elijah and Elisha. And all of these folks in their different ways, when we actually take a look at them, we'll see how they model Jesus. I'm just going to highlight, we're going to do Moses in more detail next time because we're doing the Exodus. I'm just going to give you a highlight. I have something like in the little book on Exodus, we have some of 40 points which actually mirror Jesus in the life of Moses. So I'm just giving you a sample here. They're both kind of drawn out, a son drawn out of water. We're looking at the meaning of the name Moses. It's in whole meaning in both Hebrew and in Egyptian. Implies he's a son who's drawn out of the water, which is, of course, how we see Jesus is drawn out of the water. God speaks over him and says, "This is my son." So yes, he's drawn out of the water. So Moses' name. They're both born under Gentile rule. And Moses is under the Egyptians, of course. Jesus is under the Romans. And jealousy of a bad king leads to a death sentence on children as a result of their birth. Interestingly, in Josephus, he records an old Jewish tradition, that there was a prophecy that there would be a king born in the Jews, which is what prompts the Pharaoh to want to kill the boys. So, which is even more like Jesus than the Bible tells us. And Josephus wasn't writing that to prove Jesus' birth story. He's telling us that this is what the Jewish tradition is. That there was a prophecy, and it was the prophecy of the king coming that made the king try and kill the children. Both are safe from the royal death sentence, as I said, yeah. And both reject their privileged heritage to identify with their suffering people. Think about it like that. I've got the quote there from Philippians, that Jesus didn't take his equality with God, something to hold on, but he rejects his divine heritage, just as Moses rejects his privilege as a royal person in Egypt. So we've got lots more to look at. I just wanted to put it there. But Moses shouldn't surprise us, because Moses does say that God will raise up from among your people a prophet like me. And the parallel with Jesus, when saying prophet like me, is incredible. To the degree which we don't know because we've lost the context of this. But actually, if you look in the rabbinic writings and also in the Dead Sea Scrolls, you find that the expectation of people for the messianic figure coming is they're also expecting the prophet. Remember, they say to Jesus in the Gospels, "Are you the prophet?" And when the prophet came, he would reinterpret the Ten Commandments, and they would be understood in a totally new way. Sounds like Sermon on the Mount. Okay, you're going to look at those kind of things. So that's how the Jews understood it, the person who was coming in its own day. So Moses is a really good example, but some things that are really surprising, and this is what I mean, I'll just show you, is what about someone like Absalom? You remember who Absalom is? He's not a good guy, is he? But he doesn't half look like Jesus sometimes. How does that happen? So, well, actually, let's look at the references. I've got them here. You can find them in the book. It's in the notes. He's a son of David. Well, the Messiah is going to be a son of David. And he's without, we're told, 2 Samuel, without spot or blemish. Okay, which doesn't mean he's morally good. It just means he's a good-looking lad, you know. But the point is that phrase, without spot or blemish, is used of the sacrifice that's required, and therefore we understand it as Jesus is actually referred to as being without spot or blemish. He rides a mule just before he dies. Okay, so remember, just when he dies, he's riding on the mule. Okay, he dies hanging from a tree. Okay, with a pierced side and actually thorns in his hair. Just so you remember, because his hair gets caught in the tree, so he's hanging from it, and then he gets stabbed in the side by a spear, so he gets pierced in the side. And when he dies, the Old Testament tells us that his death is proclaimed as good news. So the Greek version of the Old Testament that was around in Jesus' day and is quoted from regularly in the New Testament, the Septuagint it's called, actually uses the word evangelion for what is declared after his death. So here's somebody who's not even trying, but he kind of is modelling what Jesus is going to do. Can you see that? So that's the ideas of typology. We're going to look at types, these models that look remarkably, they kind of foreshadow what's coming with Jesus. Now that's a good example because the Bible doesn't tell us that Absalom's a type, so for certain Bible schools, that is out. But I think it's fascinating when you see it. Does that making sense? There are also things that we call Christophanies or theophanies, which is where God appears physically. Okay? And the reason is, we see this is important, the reason I used to mark them in my Bible is because the New Testament says that no one has seen God at any time, but the one and only Son who is in the bosom of the Father has made him known. So what the New Testament is saying there, John is saying, is whenever God has appeared, it's actually the Son making him known. Which ties in with what we started, which is Jesus is the full alphabet. He's everything that God is saying to humanity. Does that make sense? And that's actually, as it turns out, not a uniquely Christian perspective. The ancient rabbis believed it too. But it got dropped because it became too Christian. And this work is fascinating as a kind of recovery of ancient rabbinic teaching compared with later rabbinic teaching. So a lot of ideas got dropped because they looked too much like Jesus. Does that make sense? So I'm going to introduce you quickly to some of them. So we know, for instance, via things called the Targums, which were kind of like, because the Jews were spread out all over the world and people were often speaking Greek or other local languages, the Targums were originally passed on, we say they passed on orally, but that doesn't mean they didn't write anything down. But they didn't finally get written down for a few centuries after Jesus, but they were based on some sources that were written that were then expounded from, that go back before Jesus. And so we know from the Targums that they recognised that whenever God appeared, he seemed to appear through an active agent who they referred to as the memra, which is an Aramaic word which kind of means word. And they went, and they saw that God actually had 2 ways of communicating with humanity, the Word and the Spirit. So, Psalm 33, in the commentary on it, in the Targums that you can find, they say, where it talks about God doing creation by the Word and the Spirit, and they expound that, and talk about the Word who was there in creation in Genesis, because God spoke, see, so the Word was there. But it's not just a word, it's the memra, which is this active agent. Somehow it's someone that stands for God. And the Spirit was there because the Spirit hovers over the water and is doing something. So they take the Psalm 33 and they expound it and explain it of how the Word and the Spirit are working. Now, if I'm going to communicate to you, if you think about the logic of this is proto-Trinitarian. Trinity starts to emerge. So I don't know your name. Your name is? Lisa. Okay, so if I need to talk to Lisa, the first thing I need to do is breathe at her, okay? Which obviously, depending on what you have for lunch, is a good thing to do or not to do. Fresh and minty. So I have to breathe at you. And the word for spirit is the word breath. So actually God communicates, the first thing he needs to do is breathe. And they understood breath as being like the life of God. So I breathe, but then I have to make sounds in what I'm breathing at you, see? If I've got no breath and I just do this, it doesn't say anything. I have to put the 2 together. So my words are carried by my breath, and they come and they hit your eardrums, and suddenly the thoughts in my head are now in your head. Does that make sense? And this kind of theology was being discussed by the rabbis. Because God somehow is distinct from creation, but somehow he mediates with creation. He does it by breathing at us, that's his breath, his spirit. And the spirit carries his ideas, his words, does that make sense? To people. See how the logic goes? You see how it's kind of almost getting near to the Trinity, isn't it? This understanding. And so just to show you, so these appearances of God are actually the word appearing. That God is making concrete. It's not just his spirit is there active and changing and shaping, but he's now got message for us. See, so when there's message, we see him and he appears and he's visible. And somehow or other, simple human beings have got hold of him in a concrete way. So this is, here I'm just giving you, this is a quote. I've got loads of these quotes from Philo. Philo lived contemporary with Jesus, but in Alexandria, which had almost as many Jews living in it as Jerusalem did. So it's a big Jewish community in Alexandria. And he writes this, for the Father of the universe has caused him. Now, who's he talking about? The him he's talking about is this memra, the word. And because he's a Greek writer, rather than using Aramaic memra, he uses the word logos, okay, which John uses. But when John uses it, he's not invented something new. This is part of the rabbinic dialogue of his day. What John is doing is saying, you know that thing the rabbis are talking about, the logos, I'm going to point and say that's who he is. Does that make sense? So this is Philo writing at a similar time, around 20 to 50 BC. Can't say exactly when, but it's separate from Jesus because it's in Alexandria, but it shows you the thinking at the time. So him to spring up as, what does he call him? The eldest son. Okay, the memra, the word, God's word, is called by a Jewish philosopher, theologian, the eldest son of God. Okay? Who in another passage, this is now Moses, calls the firstborn son. So this is right here. And he who is thus born, imitating the ways of his father. Okay. Let's go on. He continues. To be adorned according to his firstborn word. You see there he's put the word in. Okay, the firstborn word. The eldest of his angels. Well, that's interesting because we always think of angels as distinct from God. But think of how many Old Testament passages the angel is addressed as if he is God. Because again, the word for messenger just means someone who walks for you. So this is God's agent. You see? So it's the same thing. He's the eldest of his angels, the primary agent that God uses to bring the message. Okay? He's also the firstborn word, the great archangel of many names. For he is called the authority and the name of God, Yahweh, and the word, and man according to God's image, and he who sees Israel. So that's from a text he wrote, it's called a Treatise on Tongues. As I say, it's totally contemporary with Jesus. It's not influenced by Jesus, but neither does Jesus borrow from it, because they're happening kind of in parallel. But it's kind of getting across, and he's drawing some of these things together. What's interesting, I've highlighted some things in purple there, because actually it sounds like he's been reading from Genesis, because there's a run of all those words and images that happen where God appears in Genesis. So God appears, his first appearance to mankind since Eden, when he appears as the Word of God in Genesis 15. So God has been there in the garden, but he's not appeared to anybody until he appears to Abraham. And so he is the Word. See, go back to the previous one. He's the firstborn Word. See? Then he appears as the angel of Yahweh, who is given the name El Roi, okay, which means God who sees me. So we go back, you notice. See, look, so he's a great archangel of many names, but also he's called who sees Israel. You see? Who sees, God who sees. And I love that because Abraham is the first person God has appeared to since he was there in the garden. The second person he appears to is Hagar. Okay. And I love that because Hagar means stranger, and you feel for this poor girl. She's got sold as a slave when Abraham is down in Egypt. She's been carted around. She's been treated as a surrogate mother at the whims of God's people, if I can put it that way, who've haven't even given her a good name. They've just called her stranger, Hebrew for stranger. Come on, you weirdo. Come on with us. And I don't want to hear me being rude, but the Bible consistently presents Abraham as a poor father and as a poor husband, and yet God uses him and then exalts him and says, you're actually going to be great. Does that make sense? And so it fits with that. And she is the second person to see God. And so she then says, God sees me and I see him. So she calls him El Roy. So he's called God who sees. He sees. See? And Yahweh, the name, which is in Genesis, so God then appears as Yahweh in Genesis 17. Actually, in Genesis, he doesn't use the name, but I think the text uses his name directly. And there's three men in Genesis, and it talks about a man after God's image in Philo's confusion of tongues. So can you get the idea? This is my take on it. As I read that, I thought, it sounds like he's been reading through those passages in Genesis, because all of those ideas, God appears, and he's talking about that whole concept. So we're keeping an eye on the time, and we're going to have to... we find elements of the Trinity, in particular, it's interesting seeing it in the names of God. Elohim is plural. Okay, it doesn't have to therefore be understood as plural, just as the English word sheep doesn't have to be plural, but it is plural. So that makes sense. Adonai it can be understood two ways. It can actually either mean my masters or my master. So it can be either of the two. So again, it's singular or plural. Just as Elohim can be singular or plural, although that's more obviously plural than Adonai. I am. That's the way the Septuagint translates as the Greek version of the Old Testament. When God says, I am. I am who I am is I am. The Greek is ego eime. And it's the Greek that Jesus uses all the time when he says, I am the door. I am the good shepherd. I am. And I put Yahweh there. Unfortunately, I don't have a flip chart because I sometimes scribble that out. But if you actually want to look at the meaning of the letters in the name Yahweh, it's got a surprising meaning. Okay, I'll tell you what it is. And the Yod, when it was first, was a hand. So it's a hand. Yod is a hand. Okay. Hey, which appears twice, was a little man with his arms up in surprise or praise. So he's literally going, hey! And actually, hey, as a word, means look at this. So it's the hand, look at this. Okay. Vav, which we often see translated as peg, but actually it's any nail or something that you hang stuff on. So it can be a nail. So the hand, look at this. The nail, look at this. Which is almost what Jesus says to Thomas, or Thomas says to Jesus, lest I see his hands and the imprint of the nails, then I won't believe. And actually that little phrase that he uses is actually the meaning of the name Yahweh in pictogram, in terms of pictures. It's got a hand, hey, look at the hand. A nail, look at the nail. Does that make sense? The name Yahweh, interesting, sorry, I'm taking too long on this. Josephus tells us that the name Yahweh is all vowels. And that surprises people because they say, I thought Hebrew didn't have vowels. And that's why they invented vowel markers. But actually, it did. It's just that every word that was a vowel could also be a consonant. Does that make sense? So we have one of those in English. We have one in English. It's the letter Y. Does that make sense? But a lot of languages have have more letters than that. And so Hebrew has 4. The thing that Josephus tells us is that all of the letters in the name Yahweh are vowels. Okay, but he doesn't use the word vowel because in the ancient world they didn't have the word vowel, but they called them breath letters. They're breaths, and breath is a spirit. So actually, the whole idea Yahweh as a name is entirely breath. It's entirely spirit, which gets to understand because ancient Judaism respected the name Yahweh, but they did not say it. In Jesus' day, some people did say it and others didn't. And so respectful Jews would not say it, not to offend those who didn't. But actually, you find that sometimes it was said. But actually, if you do try and say it, it's hard. And so the rabbis wrote that actually every time you breathe in and out, you say the name of God. Because you go, see? So if you make it as Josephus tells us it was all vowels, and you don't use the consonant hard part, you just do it the breathy part, sounds like breathing in and out. So God is spirit, because God is life. He's alive. Does that make sense? So all those kind of ideas in there. So you find various things that point to the Trinity. I put things in the name of God. Okay, here's a nice one on the names of God. You know, Psalms 23. We'll finish with this because we're going to run out of time. Psalm 23, we all love it. It's that Lord is my shepherd. Well, you know, there are 8 names where Yahweh kind of joins the name Yahweh to a kind of a quality. Remember? And actually, what's interesting is that Psalm 23 actually runs through those. I don't think it was intentional, but strangely it emerges. And what's even more interesting is that there is an explicit text in the New Testament that associates that thing with Jesus. So let me kind of show you what I mean. Last bit of brain work to do tonight, and then we'll get to go home and sleep. Okay, so look. So the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And from that phrase we get the name Yahweh Rohi. Okay? It's the names of God. He makes me lie down in green pastures, which kind of is a description of the Lord is my provider. He's providing for me. You see that? Okay. And sorry, actually, I have said Jesus, of course, is regularly called the Good Shepherd in the New Testament. But those words, the Lord is my provider, are actually spoken prophetically because the provision that God is going to give us is Jesus. So do you remember in the foothills of Mara? Mara as a word means God's bitterness, the bitterness of Yah. Mar is myrrh, which is bitter. Does that make sense? It's really funny because I think it's in Strong's Concordance actually says nobody knows what the word means except that it's spelled exactly the same as bitterness of God. So why nobody knows, I have no idea. It's just one of these weird little quirks, you know. But actually, we do know what it means. The 2 words. It's just that surprises people. The mountains of God's bitterness, which is where Jesus is going to be crucified thousands of years later, and Abraham looks up, and it says, and in the distance he saw, and he says, and the Lord will provide. The Lord will see to it. If that makes sense. The Lord will provide. So you see it in Psalm 23, the Lord's providing for us, making me lie down in green pastures. But that name itself came from a prophecy which we see fulfilled in Jesus, who when he dies on those hills as the sacrifice, there's a guy called Nicodemus, okay, who turns up, because he's a man, okay, with spices, but only a couple, myrrh, and he brings about 15 years worth of income for an average worker's poundage of it. And one archaeologist has basically said you would be able to smell it for miles and miles and miles around. He brings myrrh and aloes, do you remember? Masses of it, you see, because he's a man, that's what we do. It's like, well, Joe Malone, who knows, it's too sophisticated. Let's just get myrrh and aloes, that'll do. But let's get lots of it, you see, because he's a rich man. He's actually, his family is the 3rd richest in Jerusalem. That's something we know from history. See? Although some historians say they don't believe he ever existed. But he's written about, and his family is written about, and they're the 3rd richest. I just lose it sometimes. Some people just don't want to believe. That's the problem. Then he goes on, he leads me by quiet waters. So the Lord is my peace, because it's quiet waters. Yahweh Shalom. See how the psalm is unpacking it. But actually, come to the New Testament, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. He is our peace. Does that make sense? He restores my soul. Because actually, Yahweh Rapha, the Lord is my healer. Okay? He healed many who were sick. I could have chosen lots of verses to illustrate that one. See? He leads me by quiet... Oh, sorry, we don't come backwards. He guides me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Because actually, that's the name Yahweh Tzidkenu. The Lord is my righteousness. In Philippians, we're told, filled with the fruits of righteousness that come through Jesus Christ. The Lord is our righteousness. Where does righteousness come through? It comes through Jesus Christ. See? Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I'll fear no evil. You're with me. Why? Because the Lord is there. Yahweh Shammah. So the name Yahweh Shammah is one of his names because the Lord is there. Jesus says, I could have chosen multiple verses again where he promises to be with us. But lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age, says Jesus, because he is the God who is there. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies, because the Lord is my banner. In the context of that, you see, it's about victory, it's winning a victory. So I put it in victory in brackets. God gives us victory through Jesus Christ. You raise the banner when you've won. You put your standard over the camp. So he's our victory. Surely goodness and loving kindness shall follow me all of the days of my life, which is Yahweh Makadesh, which is the Lord is my sanctifier. Because actually we're being pursued by goodness and loving kindness. He's going to clean us up, change us, transform us. But we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ. He has sanctified us, because the Lord is my sanctifier. So in the psalm, Yahweh Makadesh is the name. So to sum it up, you can see how the Old Testament recognises the role of agents, Word and Spirit, Creator God. All the major names of God point to God's multi-unity. Jesus' character and traits and actions, how the appearance of God those appearances actually add to our revelation. And although we haven't looked really at teaching of Jesus in the Old Testament or prophecy, those are sometimes the more obvious ones. We've probably run out of time. So I think there's probably a good point of that, looking at Psalm 23, just to draw it together. Is that okay? So does anyone want to ask anything or say anything at this stage before we...
Chris, sorry, I just missed a little bit. Were you talking about, how you could see the Trinity in different ways? And you were saying about the breath carrying the word.
Yeah.
And the third bit is what, the mind? Or?
So, okay, I didn't necessarily unpack it because of times and things tonight. But the idea of a word was part of the debate, you find, is the word, is it part of creation or is it part of God? Okay. And that's not a straightforward question. This is an interesting one as an apologetic into Islam, because they recognise the Spirit of God and the Word of God. See, because it goes like this. Creation is distinct from God. Okay? But a word starts in your head. It's part of you. Does that make sense? And it's also out there. It's part of creation. See? And so the debate was, and it goes, and this is part of the Jewish debate around Proverbs 8, which has become a debating point theologically for Christians too, where the wisdom of God is personified as being with him in creation. And so actually what you find is that the thinking was there's this kind of debate because the word is kind of almost, it's not really, it's kind of begotten, not created, as the psalm goes. And that's how we not the psalm, the carol. Is it the carol or the hymn? Begotten, it's born of God rather than created, because it's actually born in God, it's part of God. Because if God doesn't have thoughts, if he doesn't have words, he's dead. But not every word that he conceives goes out. But it starts in him, which is different from when he says, let there be light, and light's out there, and it's always been out there because he said it. Does that make sense? So that is created, but this is begotten. It's drawn out from God. And so theologically, and you find this is addressed much better in the Eastern Orthodox tradition than in the Western tradition, the issue, the idea of the Son of God being representative, as we said, the Son is the thing that comes out from. That's something of the emergent God. So God is a generator who is constantly generating something. So just as a magnet is not a magnet without its field, but the field in some sense is coming out of the magnet, that something in the aliveness of God, the aliveness, means that, see, God can't eternally have been a father unless he's eternally been father to something. I was once a son, but I wasn't a father. Then I had a child and I became a father. If God is eternal father, who is he eternally been father to? Does that make sense? So there has been, eternally, there has been something that has emerged from God's fatherhood. See, and that's why we use the term the Son, but it's not quite the same as our, but that's a good way of us trying to understand it. Does that make sense? Because he is the emergent part of God. So that's going off on a bit, but thanks. So hopefully that's helpful. But does anyone want to ask anything else? Or, yeah.
So Christian, when I came here, I expected to hear you mention things like the Christophanies, like the fourth person in the
Yeah, that's right.
in the fieries
In the furnace, yeah.
You didn't mention that kind of thing. Is that too simple? Have you?
No, it's simply because we're doing a kind of this overview and we're introducing the bigger concepts. So when we kind of go through the books, you kind of, when you go through the things, you kind of point out the occurrences of these things as they occur. And you're absolutely right. So 3 men with Abraham, that's a simple thing, but here they are. A man in the flames, there's another one. The captain of salvation who appears to Joshua, here's another one. So
Well, the person who wrestled with Jacob.
the person, yes, no, that's a really good, interesting one with a long answer.
Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, which is probably not necessarily the thing here. There's a lot of different views on it, a lot of which I don't go along with, but it's hard sometimes to resolve exactly. But I think because the name he kind of gives seems to recognise him as God, that there's something in there. So, yeah, good. Well, thank you very much for being here. Hopefully, I did say at the beginning, because I find that when we do these, most people have discovered something they'd not seen before. And I say that because I've just recognised over time that actually there's something here that we've lost or not seen. Some of what I'm doing, I'm digging right the way back to the early church for. Okay, some of it I'm taking brand new research that shows us through texts that have only been undiscovered by, like in the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's revelation that's come out of those as to what people were thinking that we didn't know until a few years ago. So there's a whole spectrum, but actually there is a constantly evolving understanding. And it's interesting the impact it's having in the Middle Eastern world as Israel has come back, that there is a theological spectrum now of Jewish response to Jesus, some of which you might say crosses the line, becomes Christian, and others a bit more of a kind of rediscovery of that kind of proto form. But it's interesting that it's all happening at the moment, if that makes sense. And so there's a kind of a rediscovery of stuff going on. So a lot of those things, like the little skip codes that we looked at, as I said, were being found by rabbis. They're not being found by a computer or by me. They're by people who have actually sat there and they go, oh, look. And we think, well, why would you do that? Bible code stuff, that's just superstition. Okay, well, maybe, but it's there. There are some really weird ones. Long sentences, not just short words like Jesus. I'll throw this one in now, we'll do it properly. But actually, the beginning of the book of Ruth, okay, Ruth starts, there are 12 tribes and no king. The final word of Ruth is about the king. The book is how they go from 12 tribes to a single kingdom. Okay? And starting in verse 1, every 12th letter spells out Hashem Melech Yeshua, which is quite a long phrase, which means the name of the king is Jesus. The whole point of the book of Ruth is to tell you the name of the king was David. But starting in the first verse, every 12th letter, because it's about the ties it starts with, in the days of the judges, when they're 12 tribes, every 12th letter spells out the phrase, the name of the king is Jesus.
Okay. So those rabbis, when they find that, are they the ones who are,
that's yeah.
Are they those who actually now recognize Jesus? I mean, what's
so there is a whole spectrum. So we ought to draw it together. For instance, there is an Orthodox Hasidic Jew, which is quite one of the strict sects in Judaism, that about 5 years ago now, maybe slightly longer, raised in their kind of the global council of when those folks did, that they should now recognize Jesus as the Messiah ben Yosef. Okay, not the Messiah ben David, because they actually have, as we'll see as we go through this, we'll introduce Jewish thinking started to see multiple messiahs. And the Messiah ben Yosef comes from the north, Galilee, and he suffers. See? And so he said, actually, we got part of our punishment, if you like, was because we didn't recognize the Messiah ben Yosef. Not calling him the Messiah ben David, okay? But you see that's what I mean by this whole spectrum that is beginning to emerge. Because actually, and that's what you'd expect. Real life, different people respond different ways. If everyone did exactly the same thing, then I would be lying to you. There's a whole range of things that happen, as this stuff is coming out. So good. So let's finish there. I'll see you next time.
Next one is actually a Saturday, so we're alternating between a Sunday evening and a Saturday. Is a Sunday evening 6 o'clock? Is that okay? I mean, potentially we could move